Welcome to the Mobile Workforce Podcast, where we sit down and have real conversations with business leaders that have been where you are. During these interviews, we'll dive into what it takes to improve systems and champion processes that maximize performance. Each week, our trailblazing guests share their experiences and understanding of the workforce to help inspire change, challenge our thinking, and share what it takes to successfully travel the road to profitability. Now here's our host, co-founder and chief evangelist of About Time and WorkMax, Mike Merrill.
Hello and welcome back to the Mobile Workforce Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Merrill, and today we are sitting down with Mr. Milton Stark. Milton is a consultant who is an expert in project management and also basically running big construction projects. So we have a great conversation where we talk about scope creep and how to get control of change orders and those processes that are a challenge for a lot of companies. So I think you'll really enjoy today's conversation between Milton and I. We think we may have him back even next week and have a bigger topic and discussion around the software side of things. So hopefully you enjoy today's episode. All right, Milton. Well, it's great to have you on the podcast today. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. I'm very happy to be here.
Now, this should be a great conversation. So I guess to start things off, why don't you just share with the audience, in your opinion, what the biggest issues and challenges are today with project managers and the things that they're dealing with?
I think the biggest single issue, if we have to pick out just one, is scope management. It ties very closely into some others. I think there are significant issues to deal with. The initial definition of scope leads to issues with scope management. So that's kind of a preliminary issue that needs to be dealt with. But for the project manager working the project in the field, one of the biggest problems he has to deal with is scope management. And part of that is the scope identification itself. In other words, how do you know that it's a scope change versus just a change in your methods or process, so on and so forth? What is it that directs you to that?
So why do you think that has become one of the biggest challenges today? Is there something within the industry? Is it culture, technology? I mean, what things are adding to this challenge, do you think?
I think the biggest indicator that there's a problem existing is that, according to the PMI Institute, upwards of 70% of the projects undertaken worldwide for every aspect, construction, software development, so on, total projects worldwide, we're only running about 70% failure. Now, you notice I said 70% failure, which means we're only producing 30% of the time. And by producing, I mean we're completing our objective. We're doing it on schedule and under budget. And that's only happening about 30% of the time worldwide. That's just not a workable record. So that has driven me, and my experience has driven me into looking at what are the causal factors. And one of the big things that shows up over and over and over in all kinds of projects is this failure to manage scope. A lot of project managers call it scope creep. And the issue becomes, I say, the reason it ties back to your project planning and project development in the first place is scope creep amounts to a requirement to do work that's not defined in the project scope and therefore is not included in the project budget. So, and those are the two things for the project manager to really keep in mind. One, do I have a budget line in my project to cover this activity? If you don't, that's an immediate clue this wasn't addressed. Now, is it a scope change? That depends on how well the project was defined in the first place, how well it was developed, how well the people up front did in putting the project together. But that's a major key that you're probably dealing with the scope change, is if you don't have a line item in the budget that fits into.
Well, when you say scope change and when you talk about these things, it makes me think there's all these surprises that seem to be popping up on projects. So what do you think's adding to these surprises that are causing these issues and delays?
That's exactly what goes back to the initial development of the project in the first place. We have, in almost every industry that uses projects for implementation, we've tried to make things faster, better, gooder. We're looking for shortcuts. As a result of that, we have developed a lot of templates, and templates are a good thing. Don't get me wrong, right? Templates are a really good thing, but a template is based off of sort of a conglomeration of 2 to 5 projects that we did put together and say, okay, this is how they worked out. So my labor is generally a multiplier of this much. And, I get all these little cheat sheet numbers to build my estimate with and to build my project with and to build my schedule. I'm using things that existed before in doing the estimate. And I'm really not looking at the client's scope. So what happens very often is you get you're on the development end of the project, and you get the initial information from the client, and they say, we want a design build for this kind of building that's going to be about this size. And that immediately sends that developer off into his little book, and he's looking for, okay, what was the last group that we did of buildings this size, so on and so forth. He pulls it up, pops a template out of it, and then he starts running numbers based off of that template. But the unfortunate fact is that I swear at least 70% of the time, the developer never actually goes and reads the entire proposal. Okay? All they do is go get the fundamental information so they can categorize the project, and then they build a bid off of that categorization rather than looking to see what the project says. From my own experience, one that just was horrific for me, I actually got the project, was hired as a contractor to come in and try to bring the project out of the dirt. And the reason it was in the dirt in the first place was a very large scope of work definition. This was in the nuclear industry, and it had to do with the Fukushima recovery projects. And this company had done many same scope projects. They'd done it in France, they'd done it in Britain, they'd done it in a couple other places in the European sector, they'd done it in Japan. They were set. They knew exactly how to go about this. So when it came time to put the project together for Mexico, they put the canned project together, and here we go. Well, in the contract, in every contract that they had, that they were working off of, it specified that all of the rules and regulations of our technical specifications must be met for this project. Well, they had done that for all these other projects. So they said, yeah, okay, no problem. So they bid this contract in Mexico based on that information. Only the technical specifications in Mexico were built off of the American standard, not the European standard. And there was a single line in the specification that said welding is not permitted on the skin of the spent fuel pool. Period. One single line. That one single line ended in an over 50% adjustment to the scope of the contract because their entire design was based on tack welding to the skin. When they couldn't do that, now they had to go to a multi-ton base and put this thing into a suspension system rather than an attachment system. So the engineering completely changed. The system didn't change. The instrumentation didn't change, but the mounting and the engineering for the mounting changed 100%. It was a massive mess. Just because the guys doing the prep on the project didn't actually look at the specifications for the project, they just said, oh, hell, we've done 15 of these. This is it. That happens in every industry all the time. that's where those surprises come from. They're not surprises to the customer most of the time. They're surprises to the project.
So do you think there's something culturally? Do you think we're just not good at being detailed, maybe as we once were? Or why would it be so commonly overlooked when it comes to specifications on a given project?
Well, I'm an old man with a lot of ideas.
Good. That's why we have you on.
I think it's a culmination of many things, but those many things all allude to, coming back to what I was saying, that we spend in industry, not just in project management, but in manufacturing, in design, in development, we spend a massive amount of energy trying to figure out shortcuts on our work, right? Okay. That comes from competition. That comes from just desiring to improve, to be better. There's a lot of things that drive that, but we spend a lot of time looking for the shortcuts, and we don't always, when we find what we think is a good shortcut, such as using a template from a job that was just like this one, when we do that, we are dropping that small detail of actually verifying that the project we're planning with that template actually meets the template. So my view on the template is, rather than building, if you start with zero, you read the specifications, you line item everything, you get some drawings done, you pull the takeoffs on those drawings, so you have actual schedulable information that you can build a project off of. And that's what a template provides for you, is all of that detail in those areas that apply. So we would build that from scratch. And if you do that from scratch, then you have to read everything, know everything, understand everything that's involved in the project. So when we say we're going to use this template, we skip that part of actually reviewing the detail of the specification itself. What are the things the client has asked us to do? And more importantly, what are the requirements that we have to do? One of the kind of a crazy little example, this whole thing, the reason I'm all messed up with this stuff behind me, we're moving to Texas. And so I've been in Texas with my son-in-law, getting the home he has there ready to sell so we can all move into a bigger property. And in doing that, he needs some wiring verified and changed and checked and so on. And electrical is part of my background, so I'm going through that. And as I'm going through the wiring in the house, I noticed that the wire size isn't what normal construction is. I'm finding number 12 wire instead of number 14 wire. Okay. And it makes me curious because I'm pretty familiar with the National Electric Code and what the requirements are. And in these areas, the National Electric Code allows 14. And most places I've ever been, it says we follow the National Electric Code, and 14 is what you're going to find in those applications. But there I found it's 20. I mean, it's 12. So, okay, there's got to be a reason for this. So I go to the county codes for the county that he's in. And in the county codes, under the exceptions, it says we follow the NEC year number such and such, so like they all do. And then below that, it says with the following exceptions. And the following exceptions is that no circuit will be less than 20 amps,
12-2 wire.
Okay. So it's just a simple line in the county requirement. But if you miss that and you go with the National Electric Code, which I know is what they're using, you're screwed. So if they built that house, if you built that property, the inspector's going to come out and you've used that 14, which is in compliance with the NEC. It's compliant with all the other houses you built. It meets your standard. It meets your format. The inspector comes out and says, you got to rewire this whole house because you can use a minimum 12. That's number 14 wire. Okay. So it's that attention to detail that in many cases we lose because we're going to a template. Now those issues then transform on up into the actual project. So just in the case of that wire, there's the difference in scope. If you're doing a relatively large project, the difference in cost of number 10 wire, number 12 wire, or number 12 and number 14, the difference in that cost could be significant. But it's a hit on your budget that you weren't planning on. It's more of a material cost than you were planning on. Okay. Same thing true for the outlets and stuff that go along with it. So it's that kind of detail that we lose on the front end that we pay for on the back end. And the project manager, he gets the project, he's got drawings. And if we've gone through development, the chances are very good that those drawings are going to show the number 14 wire instead of the number 12. So the project manager's out there actually doing the job that he thinks he's supposed to be doing, and it's not going to meet the specification because the design on the front end was messed up. But it's the project manager who's going to take the hit, and it's the project manager who's going to have to figure out how to recover from that. Now, in that case, we, the client, we, the builder, we're gonna eat that cost if we made that mistake on that wiring.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great example. And I do think there's something culturally with our society where we skim things. We want Chat GPT or AI to help, fill in some of those details for us instead of making sure, double checking, the old phrase, measure twice, cut once. I think culturally and in society, maybe we've lost some of that and we're getting a little bit lazy when it comes to these details. Do you agree with that?
Well, I certainly don't disagree.
So I know, we do have software tools. Speaking of AI, there are things that can help tap us on the shoulder digitally, so to speak, and remind us. You mentioned checklists or, following some type of protocol. What are some other tips and tricks, or what's some advice you could share on helping that we don't miss these details that are so critical and could be costly if we don't catch them?
Well, one thing that I see project managers getting into all the time is when you have a true scope change coming up, and a scope change, a true scope change, a change in scope, typically means that either the project is requiring that something be done that was not included in the original scope. I'll give you an example of that in a second. Or the client actually wants to change the scope of the project. Okay. Now, that going back to changing the scope of the project, a couple of things happen with changing the scope of the project. I'm putting in a cabinet, and the client comes back and they've decided that there's another in-house project they're doing. And if we put a terminal strip in this cabinet that we're putting in, if we just add it in there, it's going to save them a ton of money on their other system. So they say, can you just throw that in there? Well, the client has a project manager, someone who's responsible for the work that you're doing. And there's you as the project manager. What happens is you go in your morning meeting and he says, oh, by the way, Joe, can you just add me a little strip right here? He said, I got them in the warehouse. I'll give them to you. All you have to do is drill 2 holes, put these 2 things in there, and so on and so forth. And the project manager says, well, that kind of sounds like a change in scope, and we need to process that through and so on. And the guy says, well, I'll tell you what, you wanted me to help you with this thing over here. You need a lift driver that's not included in your project to actually get your material moved from point A to point B. You need a lift driver. That's outside of scope. So I have 2 choices. I can give you the lift driver and you can put these things in the cabinet, or you can charge me for the things in the cabinet and I'll charge you for the lift driver.
Right.
Okay. Now the project manager goes, It was a big pain in the ass to go in and change all of this stuff, but we can work this out. That's a good idea. Well, that project manager just stepped over the line that allowed him to absolutely and totally lose control of his project, because he's going to spend the rest of his time on that project negotiating with that guy in-house to get free stuff. Okay?
Setting a precedent.
He set a precedent. And in setting that precedent, what oftentimes he doesn't realize is he's violated his own company's rules, policies, procedures, everything else, because what they're talking about is definitely a change in scope. Okay? And they all recognize it's a change in scope. And his directive as a project manager says, if change in scope shall be processed this way. He didn't do that. He went outside of that. But it was just a few $100s. And okay, so like I said, you've stepped over the line onto that slippery slope, and you'll never be able to control the project once you've done that. It's just a constant battle with the client about what kind of deal can we make? How are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? How are we going to make that work? So on and so forth. I was running a project, this been, I guess, 10 years ago, and my client this was his mode of operation. I mean, he was the perfect example of the client who wants to trade stuff on the project. So he would come to me in the morning meeting with this proposal, with this idea, say, well, I need you to do this for me. And I would look at it and say, okay, 3:00 this afternoon, I'll have a change of scope proposal for you. You can run the process through. I'll notify my people to get engineering going on it, so on and so forth. And he said, no, I can't go that route. I don't have the budget for that. Blah, blah, blah. And so it would kind of go by the wayside. It would just go away, and they would handle it themselves rather than pawning it off on us. And I met with him every morning on the project. And after we'd been on the project for 2 weeks, only 2 weeks, the project director from the corporation came out to go through the project review, so on and so forth. So we're in this big project meeting, and the project manager registered a formal complaint against me as the project manager because I was not willing to work with them on project activities. And the project director said, well, give me an example. So he did. And my project director said, sounds to me like he's doing what I'm paying him for.
Right.
Okay. So, but it would have been really easy for me to, I got to go this route, so on. It's just a trap that the project manager can get himself into, trying to do the best, the easiest, the fastest thing again, and kind of stepping around the paperwork. Well, that freaking paperwork is there for a reason.
Yeah, there's protocols in place for a reason. And like you mentioned, when you mess with the integrity of those rules and those boundaries, now there's no boundaries. And the assumption is going to be, well, I negotiated with him on this and he budged, so maybe I get him on that. He'll do it again. And pretty soon there's no rules anywhere. And this thing's just, you got the tiger by the tail, right?
Yep. He's got the tiger by the tail, and you got stripes on your back if you're the project manager. Right. And the project manager doesn't carry this culpability all on his own. It comes back to the organizational management, so on. So the organization owes something to that project manager. The organization owes that project manager two things that are extremely important. One, they need to make sure that the project manager understands the scope of where his project is, and he understands the restrictions or the rules that we want him to operate within for making these decisions, because we want him to make the decision whether it's a scope change or not and submit the paperwork. So we're going to put that monkey on his back. If we're going to put that monkey on his back, we have to make sure of two things unequivocally. One, he understands what the monkey is and how to make the adjustments on the monkey. He knows the rules. And we have to back him up 100%. If that project manager says, well, no, I'm not going to do that, that's a change of scope. And then his director or VP comes down and talks to the VP down there and says, oh, hell, he shouldn't have done that. We're going to go ahead and do that. That VP just took his project and his project manager and put him in the toilet. Okay? They have to. So you are two separate entities, the client and the project organization are two separate entities. And that's true, by the way, even if you are an internal organization. And it can get really difficult there. If you're doing an internal corporate project, as the project manager and the people responsible for that project, you have to clearly understand that you are a separate entity from the organization itself. That's what makes projects projects, and that's what makes them work. If we lose that separation, we've lost control.
Yeah, it feels like to me, some of this or much of it could be avoided with a more rigid and a more direct meeting prior to the beginning of the project, where the company says, listen, we have very strict guidelines and rules that we follow. We have to follow on these change of scope orders or, work orders, any change or variance to scope. We've got to have very defined rules and things that we follow, because, if we don't, we're going to have a problem here, and we just don't want to have delays. We don't want to have cost overruns. We don't want to have any finger pointing. Are those meetings commonly happening, or do you think people are being effective in how they're communicating before the project starts to help avoid these things?
Those meetings almost always happen.
Okay.
They're seldom effective. They turn out in many cases to be a head nodding, yeah, I agree, that's And there's two things that can come to a head nodding meeting. One is that both parties at the meeting fully understand what the job is, and they are both fully prepared to complete that job. Then you get a lot of head nodding and yeah. The other scenario, which unfortunately tends to be, I think, the more common scenario, is that at least one of the parties coming into that meeting is not fully prepared. They do not understand exactly what's going on. So they sit in that meeting, and instead of asking intelligent, directed questions that can gain something for them, they're nodding their head because they don't know enough to ask the question in the first place. There's a lot of reasons driving that. One of them can be that we've made a corporate decision in many cases to separate the project development away from the project implementation. So the development is done by a group over here of estimators, developers, so on and so forth, who are never going to be in the field with that project doing any of that work. They will most likely never be involved in that meeting that you're talking about, and they'll never be involved in the contract negotiations. But they put all the package together. They put it together. They hand it to a contract negotiator, a contract manager, and a project manager today, and they go into that meeting tomorrow. They don't know. They have to sit there and nod their head, because the only option for them otherwise is to say, I don't know what you're talking about. That doesn't play very well, okay? The solution to that is to get those people involved much earlier in the process. The project manager, if you have a project manager who's handed the project on the day the contract is signed, you've got a problem already. I don't care if he's the best project manager in the world and it's the best developed project, you're handing the man a package to implement that he doesn't really know, but he has to do stuff tomorrow.
Right.
Okay? So he needs to be involved much earlier in that process. My own feeling is the project manager who's going to run the project needs to be involved in the decisions made prior to the contract negotiation. I like the project manager that's going to run the project to be the guy that develops the project in the first place. Sure. But that honestly is impractical. There's a happy medium in there someplace where we can use estimators given the proper information and developers to put things together and so on without taking full-time effort of a project manager in that scope. But the project manager needs to be aware of that, involved in that, and when the contract is signed and you hand that project to the project manager, he needs to be able to take that project and say to himself and to his client, I know what we're doing and I'm ready to go do this project. And many, many times that doesn't happen. And the reason I know that is I've spent most of my career as a contractor. And my contract work in project management, actually as a project manager, has almost always been, this project has already been started, it's failing, could you come help us? Okay, that's the kind of thing, and it just happens all the time. And it's not the fault of the project manager per se, it's not really the fault of the developer, it's the fault of how we structure our project development line out, so on and so forth. And that's the reason why you see a lot of organizations standing up PMOs, project management offices. Project management office that's doing what it should be doing is sort of like a project-specific quality assurance group. They don't really do the project. If you have a project management organization that's developing projects, you probably got things structured wrong. They should be working with the processes and helping select software. And software is a big, big conversation about all the things that are available and really, really good. But when we have that conversation of software, there's a balance between using software as a tool to help you do a job and turning the job over to the software and expecting to be successful.
Yeah, we know obviously there's a cost to software, and then there's also, it's not just the subscription or the SaaS product that you're paying for every month or annually, but also to manage that software and to support it and to maintain it and to host it, to deal with it, right? To have security around it. There's overhead aside from that. So what types of software systems are you recommending that companies leverage more fully or leverage at all if they're not currently?
I really haven't made any determination on a particular kind of system or a particular system. I'm sort of in favor of an ERP system which takes one set of software and does your financials, your procurement, all of that stuff under one umbrella. And the primary reason for that is the integration of those activities is much simpler done if they're all within the same program. My input to the software that we use is not really what software we're using. It's how we integrate that software together and how we make it work as a system. And I'm not sure if we want to move on into that conversation right now, because that's a very large conversation all on its own that is connected to but separate from the scope issues that we're talking about.
Well, maybe what we'll do is we'll have you on next week and we'll talk a little bit further on the software side of things, because I do know that is a much larger conversation. Of course, you get down all kinds of rabbit holes from there. As far as this conversation today, so it sounds to me like culturally there are some challenges that we have. There are some process issues and communication issues that we have also. And then also, like we discussed, setting proper expectations up front and then following those through the process so we don't erode away that, that structure and integrity of how we're going to manage these projects. Having said all those things, what's the one thing that you really hope the listeners take away from our conversation today?
I hope listeners take away from the conversation today just simply the fact that scope management is a major issue, and that the resolution to scope management actually lies in the development and definition of the project more than it does in the project managers working the project on the far end. It's what we do on the front end that provides the functionality and ability for the project manager to define and control scope as he moves on. If we have not clearly defined the scope and our processes on how to handle a scope change, and it's really, the definition is really quite simple. When you put a project into place, when you sign a contract, that contract actually involves only two things. Everything else supports two things. It's the cost and the schedule. Okay? Everything contract-wise, when I'm talking about the client that you're dealing with, you sign a contract with them, that entire conversation revolves around cost and schedule. And how do we evaluate success on a project? Within cost, within schedule, and complete the project. So cost and schedule are the two big things. So if a project manager is working a project and he sees anything going on, and in the back of his head he says, that's going to impact my budget, he needs to be evaluating a scope change. If he says, that's going to impact my schedule, he needs to be evaluating the scope change. Now, there's some specific criteria that go along with whether or not a change to schedule is a scope change. It doesn't have to be, but if you're changing the schedule, you need to be asking that question and looking at why you're changing the schedule, because it could be a change in scope. And budget, if you're changing the budget, and unless you're doing something so simple as taking money from the transportation group and giving it to the engineering group within your own project, that's not going to be a scope change for the client or addressed as a scope change. That might be a management issue within your own organization. That's not a scope change. But the big thing is, if you need money to do something and it doesn't fit in your existing project budget, then you've got a scope change. You need to just figure out how you're going to deal with it and how you're going to process it and stuff.
Yeah, well stated. So change of money or change of time in any regard, there's got to be a scope change defined and agreed upon.
You've got to evaluate, because there's probably a scope change. Okay. One of the things I've found over the years that gets you into trouble real fast is when you start using absolutes in a conversation that requires evaluations. Okay? So I can absolutely say if your budget changes, you need to evaluate whether or not you have a scope change. But I won't say that if your budget changes, you have a scope change. You might just have a budget screw up. Okay? But but you have to evaluate. You have to look at it and then deal with it appropriately.
Love that. Well, very insightful. Lots of things for the listeners to consider and maybe compare against what they're doing today and maybe some of the challenges they're having. I hope that they could take some of your wisdom and have some lessons learned that they can improve as they move forward. It's been a lot of fun having you on. And like I said, let's get you back here for next week and we'll talk more about the software side and how companies can better deal with these challenges.
Okay. I'd love to do that.
Thanks, Milton. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you for joining us today on the Mobile Workforce Podcast, sponsored by About Time Technologies and WorkMax. If you liked the conversation we had today or were able to learn anything new or helpful, please make sure to follow us on our WorkMax page on LinkedIn and on Instagram at WorkMax_. And subscribe to the show on iTunes or your preferred podcast platform so you will never miss another insightful episode. Also, If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating and review and share the show with your friends and colleagues. Your support means the world to us and will allow us to continue providing impactful information with others looking to improve their results in their business and, in turn, their life.